Mayor, MAPS 4 is a very different kind of MAPS for Oklahoma City, taking on pressing human needs issues and neighborhood projects with a few large construction projects or renovation efforts thrown in. It's no debt, pay as you go, as MAPS has always been. It's billed really as sustaining the renaissance of the city. In some ways, also, I'd say the success of every Oklahoma City mayor and the city itself is defined in a way by whether he or she can convince the voters to pass MAPS or carry it through. No pressure. So,
it's
Mayor,
not all about me. Just want to make that clear, but thank you.
The council, too, of course. So, Mayor Holt, I'd like to ask you, after these so many years of MAPS projects, why should people vote yes on number 4?
Well, sure, and that happy to make that argument and probably back up just a little bit. And you previewed some of it, but briefly as I can for a $978 million package, try to just say a little bit about what's in it, without going into too much detail. We can certainly take this with questions anywhere you want to go, but it is an 8-year, 1-cent sales tax. As you described, that's basically following the model of the last 26 years, the 3 previous iterations of MAPS. The council has adopted a resolution that states our intent to spend the $978 million that it is expected to raise on 16 different projects that really fall into 4 categories, buckets sometimes I refer to them as. You've got really human needs, you have neighborhood needs, you have sort of quality of life, what some people might think is more traditional sort of MAPS projects for like MAPS 1 and 3, and then you finally got sort of a jobs kind of economic growth package that makes the 4th bucket. So within the and by the way, trying to remember I'm intimately familiar with all 16 projects, but trying to remember them off the top of my head has proven to be a struggle, some sort of personal test, and I'll have to come up with some kind of really long. You got it, perfect. So let me just, again, a sentence or two on each. I know that it's we don't have 2 hours, so and we heard. To recap the process, we went through a year really of conversation about this and had 26 hours of council meetings just to hear, detail on these projects. It was the most transparent, inclusive way we've ever approached MAPS, but I really felt like that's just what the times demand, that people, even though sometimes voter rates indicate a growing apathy, those who are engaged are really engaged, and I really certainly wanted to meet that expectation. And also I just felt frankly that, projects ought to be able to, live and die in the public eye. I mean, we ought to, if they can't sustain, 2 hours of discussion at council, then they really shouldn't be done. And I think that really was borne out. And I think that things, even sometimes I would see people who were skeptical about a certain project grow less skeptical as they saw the presentation. That was usually how things worked out, is that people saw the need, even if it wasn't their first instinct. And so all the things that ultimately the council decided to hear about, so that was the process in and of itself. We had public meetings just to adopt this agenda back in May or June. And then in June, July, and August, we heard about them all. So anyways, it was quite a process, and it certainly, I think, hashed things out and left it to where when we announced the package of what we were probably, going to adopt, or at least we were going to consider adopting, there were no surprises, and 10 years ago in the past, that's entirely possible that people might have heard about MAPS projects for the first time when the council said this is what it's going to be, because a lot of those meetings and conversations that happened behind closed doors. That was not the case this time. So we are proposing on December 10th, a tax that would fund these 16 things. So parks, $140 million. That includes about half of that going to a total rehab of all of our neighborhood parks. So all the parks basically outside of downtown, as well as some sort of earmarked parks projects, including $29 million for youth soccer fields, some other sort of rec center and park projects across the city, some new parks in certain parts of the city that don't have them at all, as well as, and this will be a recurring theme, sort of an operating fund. We don't call it an endowment, but that's kind of the concept if you're familiar with that, to cover the added operations of the park renovations. Because, for example, a lot of people would like to see maybe in some neighborhood parks some bathrooms where they aren't today. Well, to be very, very simple, I mean, like, who's going to pay for the toilet paper and the cleaning of those bathrooms? So we're creating an operating fund to address that. In MAPS 3, we didn't create operating funds. We did capital alone. And as a policymaker today, 10 years later, we found that to sometimes be a challenge. And I'd like to, this may or may not meet all the needs of the future, but it sure is a good start to have these built into some of these projects. And I'll refer to them where they come up. Youth centers, $110 million. So just to point out, between parks and the youth centers component, you have $250 million going to our Parks and Rec department, and it is sorely needed. This is a community that for many decades failed bond issues for parks. So if you drive around our city and look at our parks and our rec centers, you will see a lot of neglect. And you'll see some pockets of excellence where we've been able to invest in the last 20 years, but there's a lot still left behind. We have over 150 parks in our city. So this will make such a generational impact on parks and on our rec centers. So the youth center component would fund at least 4 state-of-the-art youth centers to the tune of about $70 million total, another $30 million for an operating fund, and another $10 million for a capital improvement fund. That's unique among all the projects that we have that here, but we felt like with youth centers, they're uniquely capable of getting stale, that young people want the newest technology and whatnot, and we wanted to have that
Mayor,
addressed there.
quick question. With parks, would there be new components to the parks other than bathrooms? Would there be any?
Sure. I kind of envision it a little bit like Maps for Kids, if you've been around that long, where Maps for Kids sort of said, here's this bucket of money for all the schools of OKCPS. And then after the vote, going into those neighborhoods and saying, what do you want in your school? Well, I think that's much like what we would do, the process we would embark upon here. What is it you want in your park? Is it a bathroom? Is it a spray ground? Is it a pavilion? Is it just somewhere sidewalks through and around the park? All of those things, playgrounds, new shade structures over the playgrounds, all of those things would sort of be a part of, I anticipate, public meetings around the city for the areas that surround those neighborhood parks.
And then with youth centers, how would those be different than what, say, the Boys and Girls Club offers? Would there be competition?
Not terribly different. We only have one Boys and Girls Club in the entire city, one standalone Boys and Girls Club. And so that's a model for us. I mean, we look at the Boys and Girls Club and we think we need more of that. This is a 620 square mile city. So the one Boys and Girls Club standalone facility that we have at Memorial Park just isn't enough. So, and we, in the crafting of this resolution, we certainly left the door open for partnerships. I wouldn't promise it by any means, but it is certain, the door is certainly open for this to literally become a Boys and Girls Club at some point, or partnership with the YMCA, or be a standalone. I mean, it'll always be a city-owned facility, just like the Boys and Girls Club is in our park. But there's entirely the opportunity there for these to evolve into partnerships in the years ahead with existing, community organizations that provide those kinds of services. And if that's not what materializes, that's fine too. We're prepared to operate them as youth centers within our Parks and Rec system. Senior wellness centers, a fifth one, we've kind of, with the 4 that we're building in MAPS 3, we can kind of see there's a geographic hole. Most likely, if you just put them on a map, you can tell near Northwest is really not covered. So we'd like to cover that. And we'd also see an emerging problem with the MAPS 3 senior centers in lower income parts of the city. We want everybody to be able to enjoy these, but the long-term viability of them in those areas, because these were always designed to be self-sufficient, is a little bit challenged. And so we created an operating fund here to provide low-income scholarships for users of our senior centers. Mental health and addiction. This is a really interesting area that obviously the city proper has not been directly involved in, in many ways in the past, but it time and time again in conversations about MAPS 4 over the last year, this was maybe the top issue. We eventually had to figure out, well, what does that mean? And that's what a lot of this, why this process, it was good to do it methodically and thoughtfully and over time, because it's easy to say, well, let's put money into mental health, but what do we really need? I mean, what's an actual structure? Because all this ultimately is basically capital and operating funds to operate that capital. So here is no different. This is not a programmatic thing. It is the creation of 2 new crisis centers. We have 2 already in Oklahoma City, but we need more. This would also relieve pressure on the county jail. We also have what is dubbed a restoration center. This is kind of a model out of San Antonio that has a crisis center element, but also has substance abuse elements and a meth detox. And then finally, some transitional housing for for those coming out of a crisis center but who don't have a home. All of that is encompassed in a $40 million mental health and addiction package.
I'd like to stop and ask
Yeah.
you about that. I mean,
Just jump in
the
anytime.
one thing about this maps, of course, is that you're taking on some very big social issues: homelessness, mental illness, domestic violence. That seems to differentiate this maps. What's the thinking behind why we need this in maps? I mean, there's some critics saying that these are very large social issues. We're trying to put some funding behind it. Can we really move the needle on those problems, which are really statewide issues too?
Yeah, well, 26 years ago, if I take you back to the beginning of the MAPS journey, the greatest challenge seemingly right in front of our faces was that nobody wanted to live here. It was just lame, right? And so we had to invest in fun things to do. That was the crisis, because it was hard to imagine even thinking about mental health and addiction because we had no economic activity to fund, the types of tax-driven services that would assist challenges like that. So we started there. We started in building an economy, and we felt like building an economy meant building a city where people wanted to live. So, we built all these we brought in all these building blocks of a great American city, mostly a great American downtown, whether it be a convention center or a huge park or, a downtown streetcar, or looking back to Maps 1, the arena and the ballpark and the canal. Well, after investing in that for 26 years, we've addressed that issue to a great extent. There aren't many holes in our portfolio of major public buildings. And where there is one, I think and I'll address it here in a few minutes. It's in Maps 4. So if you're having this conversation in 2018 and 2019, what is the crisis of today? If Maps has always been about sort of addressing these gaping holes that we have, and in 2001 it was education, specifically our school buildings. Well, what we heard time and time again was that it wasn't more fun stuff to do. I mean, that's a competition that never ends, and there's a little bit of that in Maps 4. But it was mental health and domestic violence and substance abuse. And you're right. I mean, that is traditionally in Oklahoma primarily been a state responsibility. But, are we going to wait forever for them to do that? We have to do what we can. I can guarantee you, like, for example, 2 new crisis centers. The state I don't know how long we would have to wait for the state to build 2 more crisis centers for Oklahoma City's use. I just don't see that happening, So, if we're going to have it, we've got to build it. Now, built into the resolution that we passed is the idea that somebody else would pay for the operations. The presumption, it's not stated there, but the presumption being the state and, the secretary Terry White, whatever her title is.
Right.
She came to us and said, we'll fight for this funding. And so, that's the expectation, but conditions are built in. If the funding never comes, we're not necessarily in a position to take on long-term operating expenses of new functions of government. But in partnership with other levels of government who are more accustomed to those types of operating costs, I think we can come to the table with some capital buildings that the state government is highly unlikely to ever build for us. So it's a partnership, and it moves the needle.
The resolution talks about, in several places, about
Yeah.
measurables.
Yeah.
How do you come up with measurables for changing mental health status for Oklahoma City, or homelessness, or domestic violence? Is there any thinking already about what those measurables will be? How will we know whether it's successful?
Well, I don't think any funder of those causes in our city or anywhere in our nation just hands money out without some sort of measurables. And maybe they're simply about people served, but we didn't get into great detail in the resolution about what those measurables would be, but it was kind of an expectation that came out of our council meetings about these topics was that there'd have to be something, and I recall multiple council members bringing that forward, as we develop these projects and we have operating agreements, we've got to have some expectations for what, is actually going to be accomplished. And, that'll be a debate in and of itself. And it's probably a good time to say every MAPS has worked this way in that there are so many questions that are answered after the vote. I've had people say, here's an example with like the multipurpose stadium that I'll get to in a minute, say, well, is the field going to be oriented east-west or north-south, you know? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, that's what it says. That is 5 years ahead of your time on that question, you know? That is, there is a very real role for the Citizens Advisory Board that has traditionally become a part of MAPS, and we have at least one. I can't see everybody, but we've got at least one Citizen Advisory Board member here from MAPS 3. And he well knows it's like a full-time job. So there are a lot of questions that are answered. We answered a lot more questions than are typically answered. You know, the resolution on this is 10 pages long. That is 9.5 pages longer than the MAPS 3 resolution. So there is a lot more detail, but nevertheless, there's a lot of questions to be answered. But I think at least in the resolution, we define the known unknowns, you know, a little bit.
For marginalized communities, for areas of the city that feel neglected, Northeast Oklahoma City, South Oklahoma City.
Yeah.
What are some of the highlights in this proposal that would benefit those communities?
Well, there are, I mean, it's game changing in terms of how much actual direct spending projects are happening in places like South Oklahoma City and in Northeast Oklahoma City, where we now sit. And we've gone through and made those lists. You know, look at Northeast Oklahoma City. You know, every park in Northeast Oklahoma City being renovated. Quite likely, not promised at this point. The 4 youth centers have not been cited, but you know, the strong potential for a youth center in Northeast Oklahoma City, as well as in that parks and in that youth center components in the line items of the resolution are multiple, you know, new park in far Northeast, renovations to the Northeast Community Center, you know, equity at the already funded Douglas Center with the other youth centers. You know, we look at transit. We're talking about a bus rapid transit line to Northeast Oklahoma City and a bus rapid transit line to South Oklahoma City. We've got, you know, $75 million just for sidewalks and bike lanes, which would, of course, encompass aspects of Northeast and South. You've got the animal shelter is in South Oklahoma City. The Innovation District is in Northeast Oklahoma City. The Freedom Center and the Clara Looper Civil Rights Center for $25 million, 16 for capital and 9 for an operating fund and an endowment. You know, that's at 23rd and MLK, a refurbishment of a critical historical building in our city, and an adjacent, you know, civil rights museum is fantastic for our whole city, but especially for Northeast Oklahoma City to have that story preserved and told. Also, just $16 million of new construction at 23rd and MLK is a great new development, which will hopefully be a catalyst and a draw. Beautification has multiple projects within Northeast and South Oklahoma City. So, and we don't know where a stadium might be, but there's a lot of people who would like to see it in South Oklahoma City. So, you know, there's, throughout this, marbled in are projects definitely in communities that have felt, you know, left out of the direct spending of MAPS in the past. We certainly have every reason to feel that MAPS has helped the whole economy of the city. But what I heard time and again, leading up to this was the idea that we needed to see its power unleashed directly into the neighborhoods, directly into people's daily lives. And so we certainly heard that. And when you take it in its totality, the effect it can have in Northeast and in South Oklahoma City is really, I think, quite transformational.
I should note that the first MAPS passed with 55% of the vote. The second one...
53, by the way, but yeah.
I looked that up. Well, it was...
Oh, but whatever. Not an overwhelming...
The next one, 61%, MAPS for kids.
Right.
Then it went down, kind of seesawed down to 54% when the shift was to downtown. And then, so now that it seems to be focused on neighborhoods and not necessarily downtown, you would think that would bode well for the vote. Your thoughts? Yeah,
I think so. And by the way, I did divert from all the other projects. You probably thought that was tedious. So we could go back to that if you want. But of course, there's okc.gov/maps4 if you want to get into the weeds a little bit of what I was describing. You know, I got through maybe a quarter of it. But I would say, yes, I've actually kind of publicly spoke of that pattern, not as one I think that anyone has necessarily designed, but it does kind of work that way where you do all this stuff downtown. And then, you know, it's sort of in the triage of your city. You can see the neighborhood needs that rising up in that decade that's passed. And so that's what we did with Maps for Kids. And then after Maps for Kids, the city looked downtown again and saw, a lot of gaps still that we didn't have. Even though Maps had renovated the Myriad to be a convention center, it was still pretty weak for a city our size, and so they wanted to address that. The park was an opportunity presented by the relocation of I-40. The downtown streetcar was sort of an important component to a growing plan for transit in the whole city. But then, that having run its course, as we sit here in 2019 having this conversation, the neighborhood needs have kind of risen to the top again. And we're still opening MAPS 3 projects. It would seem, it just, I don't know, I think it would strike people a tad odd to be focused on downtown right now with new investments when we still have the MAPS 3 investments, many of them yet to fully, blossom, with the park opening this month and the convention center opening a year from now. Let's let all that sort of ripen and see how all that goes. And again, we've sort of, with all of these things between MAPS 1 and 3, we've kind of put all the building blocks in place. The only thing, and I'll touch upon a project that I didn't get to a minute ago, the only thing that probably we lack as far as sort of these fundamental building blocks of a great American city as far as public facilities go is a stadium. We're the only top 50 city that doesn't have a multi-purpose stadium where you can play, even the 6A state championship game. And so that's in here. It's a pretty modest version. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. I mean, the Rams, I think, are about to build like a $2 billion stadium, and we're building a $37 million stadium. So, we don't know a guy who's going to give us a $2 billion stadium for $37 million, but it gets us in the door, and it gets us, to where we finally have a little bit of that amenity addressed. And that could be most likely in a central. It may not be downtown, but it would certainly probably be in a central part of the city. But that aside, as you said, this is mostly sort of spread around the city, neighborhood needs, and maybe that is a pattern. I'll leave that to the mayor of MAPS 5 and MAPS 6 to dictate whether the pattern continues. But 1 through 4, that has emerged as the pattern.
Mm-hmm. Let's turn to critics. There's some, and the one cited quite often in some of the meetings was the question of log rolling. It's an all or nothing vote. Mm-hmm. They've used some pretty strong language. You're
talking about one person, but I understand.
Dishonesty, fraud, unpalatable all or nothing choice. And a Sooner poll found that 8 in 10 voters wanted to vote on each individual project rather than all at once. And there might even be some legal questions surrounding this approach. What are your thoughts on these?
Well, I want to state very clearly, there is no legal issue with this. The voters are voting on a general fund tax of 1 penny for 8 years. It's sort of the gold standard of municipal finance. Separately, the council has adopted a resolution in stating our intent of how that money will be spent. And for 26 years, I think the city, I don't think many people disagree with that, have established a really good reputation of keeping their word. People may not have liked what their word was initially, but they've always kept it. You can always, people may or may not love projects from the past, but they were always built as, basically as promised. So all the voters are voting on is a 1 cent, 8-year general fund tax. There's no legal issue there. It's not log rolling in that sense. In log rolling, not everybody has a political science degree, is the concept where you group a lot of things together, and that would be theoretically barred under the state constitution. But that's not what the voters are being presented with here. To the question of wanting to vote on it individually, I mean, that's fine. That's just not MAPS, and MAPS, what I hear just as strongly, and I've seen polling that shows 80 to 90% approval for MAPS and a belief that it's been good for our city. Well, the idea that it's this broad, comprehensive package that covers a lot of different needs, and maybe you're going to love some things more than others, that's intrinsic to MAPS. That is MAPS. It has always been sort of part of the model that we brag on around the country, that it meets all these different desires. I'm mayor, so I get out of my bubble. And in the afternoon, I'll talk to somebody who's like, why are we doing this homelessness? That's the worst idea I've ever heard. And in the afternoon, I talk to somebody who says, stadium. There is nobody who wants that stadium, And the truth is, they're both wrong. I hear people who are as passionate about the Chesapeake Arena and the stadium and the State Fair project and could could completely do without anything else in this package, just as much as I hear from people who are passionate about the human needs addressed in this package and think that the stadium is the worst idea they've ever heard. So I think, look, my goal in life as a public servant is for everybody to win if that's possible. I don't believe in, I'm fully aware that the current American political trend is I win, you lose, and yeah, I want to vote on it all individually. Who doesn't want to just pay for what they like and have nothing else occur, right? But the reality is that's not how this works. And by this, I mean society. We all have to have outcomes where, if at all possible, the maximum possible people see their needs addressed as they perceive them, and that there's a win-win outcome. And if I can guide this process towards a win-win outcome where people who like stadiums and arenas are happy and people who like homeless housing and mental health facilities are happy, to me, then I've succeeded as mayor. And all of that, MAPS is sort of a microcosm of that whole theory. It's been this belief since 1993 that, hey, people who like the arts, people who like sports, people who like the state fair, all of them should be able to enjoy, the rewards of better facilities and a better quality of life. So there's also practical concerns. That's more of a philosophical argument I just made. I don't even know how you would do that. I mean, would you split up the penny to where, like, a $17 million diversion hub would receive 1/108th of a penny for 8 years, or would you have different months over the 8 years assigned to different projects, and so depending on which ones passed or failed, the tax would go up or down? I mean, it's not even really practical. What we find is, it's an interesting conversation to have. It is not something that I have sensed any passion about. Ultimately, people sort of, it's worth saying, it's worth discussing, and we just did, but ultimately people say, you know what, you're right, MAPS is what it is. This is a model that's proven to be a national model for 26 years, and let's move forward with it. And that's why I think ultimately this package got a 9-0 vote by people who are responsive to the voters. And we'll see, obviously, the voters have the ultimate say, which is sort of the beauty of it. I've always thought, if you didn't like a MAPS project in the past, your beef is not with Mayor Norick or Mayor Cornett, it's with the voters, and that's ultimately the outcome we'll have here.
And we'll turn to the audience for questions in just a minute. One, potential obstacles. Throughout the resolution, it talks about the council, the mayor, are proposing with the intention of this or with the intention of that, implying that you don't know what might happen in the future, whether the money won't be there. What are some of the potential obstacles, and how would we react? A recession, for example?
Yeah, well, we've been at this, and I say we, the royal we. I was in high school when MAPS passed, but for the we as a city have been at this for 26 years, so there's a lot of good lessons learned. If you remember MAPS 1, for example, it was a 5-year tax, and it wasn't going to raise enough money to do everything that was promised. And so they actually went back to the voters and had another vote for a 6-month extension to, as it was dubbed then, finish MAPS right. And so that passed, but it illustrated that, hey, they hadn't quite figured out everything, and maybe the economic prognostications fell short. Contrast that, with maybe more learning experience. MAPS 3 ended up raising, and I remember the campaign for MAPS 3 and the opponents saying, oh, that'll never raise $777 million. They're just wrong. Well, those opponents were right. It raised over $800 million. So, we've gotten a lot better at the city, I think, of being, financially sound and good at estimating. And you mentioned a recession. They assume a recession. I mean, over 8 years, we're going to have a recession. So that's figured in. I don't know if we're ready for like the Great Depression, but, we'll have a lot of more problems than whether we can build a stadium or not if we have a Great Depression. So, but they assume a recession. And so that's built into the economic model. So I think in fact, we kind of went on the conservative side with most of the expectations here financially. So I would love for my successor, 8 years down the line, to have the problem of having extra money, which is a problem we have right now with MAPS 3. We're kind of, not a problem, but nice problem to have. We're figuring out how to allocate an extra $50 million, basically. And I think based on the conservative approach we took here, and the great track record that our city financial staff has, I think we'll have more than enough money. Buried in every one of these projects, of course, are challenges and there's conditions built in, not necessarily hard conditions. I mean, I'll give you an example of one that's an easy one, but it's built in because we wanted to be thoughtful. In the resolution, it says, we won't build this family justice center operated by Palomar until we have an operating agreement with an operator, and we'll give that till 2026 before we would sort of walk away from the project. Well, we're going to have an operating agreement with Palomar probably in January of next year. That's not going to be a hard condition to meet. But we wrote it in because, that's what you do. I'm a lawyer, I just had to write it in. But we picked these sort of arbitrary date, usually of 2026, to where, we'd have some date where, these conditions had not been met. But every condition, I imagine, will be met. I don't think there's any too terribly heavy lifts. In terms of that within the resolution, and the expectation that MAPS 4 will be realized as we all envision.
Thank you. Let's open it up to audience questions. We have Vivian to my left and Rachel to the right. Just hold your hand up if you have a question to ask. There's one in the back there.
The $106 million that would be bringing in on the operating fund, so that would be probably invested conservatively to be able to be put out. And when I asked the city manager, it said, it might be 2 to 3%, which, is only going to bring
4% is actually the expectation.
And then, but at like a 1/32 of a cent would bring in that much or more. It seems like, you could have more money for the longer term if we would just do a little bit more for operations versus having this $106 million sitting there with the possibility of not 4% also.
So the question is, just to clarify for everybody, when you say 106, you've added up all the different operating funds throughout sort of MAPS 4 into one. And so, and the argument is to just do a permanent tax instead. Potato, I think basically what I considered going into this process was the background being MAPS 3 having no operating dollars at all. So you got, a streetcar being operated for $4 million a year. Well, where does that come from? Well, we figure it out, but it's not built in, the park is going to rely significantly on philanthropy. The senior centers rely entirely on membership fees. I wanted to be more thoughtful about that. So to me, the way of keeping it within the MAPS model, which is this temporary 1 cent tax, was to do the operating funds. There's lots of people in our state who think that the TSET model and others are fantastic and good planning, and so I feel good about it. What you're suggesting is not like evil or anything. It's just a different way to have done it and not the way we're going. But, long term, of course, being a policymaker at the city level, I'm always interested in ways to get more operating funds that the people will support. I know you're involved in, for example, the parks petition. Like, that's not a bad idea. an eighth of a penny for parks operationally would be welcome, at City Hall. So we'll see where all that goes. I think the biggest focus I see after this for an operational tax in our city, if we really want to move the needle on transit, I'd like to see, that pursued in the years ahead, because transit is an operational heavy. We have $87 million in here for transit from a capital perspective, but operationally, that's really where you really need, if you're going to improve bus service, you've got, $30 million a year, $30 million worth of buses cost $30 million a year to operate. So you've got to have an operational component there long term. So, but I think what I intended to do with MAPS 4's package was have operational dollars that would cover what MAPS 4 was doing, not necessarily solve all the other problems of the city. And I think we basically have that here. And where we don't have it, that's sort of identified in the resolution, and we sort of contemplate how we would move forward.
Another question from audience over there. Any other questions? Question here.
A simple one. On the operational fund, so it's $106 million. Are you allowed to actually spend that, or is it only the interest?
So as stated in the resolution, the idea is that it would just be interest. We would create, a trust would be created that would manage it. And as David was, the gentleman over here was just alluding to, we could do an investment strategy that I think would actually, the city manager and others who are good at this would tell you would probably yield, an average above 6% per year, but the spend policy would always be 4 to be conservative, so that, because some years it's going to yield nothing, right? I mean, there'll be years where it yields 12, there'll be years where where it loses money, maybe, but in the end, this is how universities and foundations and wealthy people, this is a very normal financial practice. So the spend policy would be to yield 4% a year. We built into there the expectation that, because you had to think through, well, do we need an endowment to run a youth center 100 years from now if the youth center was torn down 50 years before that? We have to think through the long-term future. And so we created, the expectation in the resolution that these would be held, basically harmless for, I think it was 40 years is what we said. And then at that point, the trust would figure out how to move forward. If they still need those resources for the purposes from MAPS 4, hopefully they would continue to use them. But, if we've moved on and there's some other needs, at least they'd have, it could be an interesting problem for somebody else in 40 years to have $100 million. To have.
And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the operating expenses are set aside for 5 of those projects. It's not for every single project.
Right. Yeah. Not everything, obviously has that. It's just where we were doing something new, and it was really our, purpose in, our traditional role. And, I just didn't want it to leave it entirely to, we'll figure it out. That's what we did in 2009. Yeah. Sure.
Question in the back?
Thank you.
How do you determine which sidewalks get fixed?
Yeah, good question. So sidewalks is its own topic. And if I might delve into it just for a second, we basically spent 50 years not building sidewalks, right? An archaic technology. Why would we need our legs anymore? We've invented the automobile, But obviously in the last 10 or 15 years, there's just been a total shift back to, maybe we'd like to walk occasionally, and we'd like to have, not do it in the middle of the street. And so in 2007, in the bond issue of that year, the voters actually approved, I think, about $70 million worth of sidewalks. And in that bond issue, the philosophy was we will build sidewalks every single time we resurface a road. That sounded like a good idea until we did it, and then we were building sidewalks in weird places. So, and so we decided, let's be more strategic. So 2 years later, in MAPS 3, we included another tranche of funding for sidewalks specifically. And in this case, the thought was, well, let's do it where they're really needed. Let's be strategic about it. Let's think about schools and libraries and commercial centers. And then there were yet more sidewalks in the 2017 bond issue. Basically, every voter-approved initiative, except for Big League City over the last 12 years, has had sidewalks in it. And this will be no different. So last year, the mayor and council adopted a plan called Bike Walk OKC, and it's got, another kind of look at the sidewalk issue and where they're needed. And there's these things called pedestrian priority areas, PPAs. And so they're referenced in the resolution. And so that's kind of the idea. To answer your question, is there's some stated areas in the resolution where there would be an emphasis on sidewalks. There's also allusions to, these pedestrian priority areas. But basically, we'll be strategic. And of course, there'll be people who think that their priority should be higher than it is. And, it's just this massive city. Yeah, your street. It's yours. Yeah. Everybody thinks it should be their street. We have, I don't say this enough, we have 620 square miles. So you can fit Philadelphia, Manhattan, Boston, Miami, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. simultaneously inside the city limits of Oklahoma City. But we have the same number of taxpayers as like one of those cities. We have about the same number of people as Boston, but Boston's 70 square miles and we're 620 square miles. So it's a challenge, and it's not rocket science. It's just, how much you're going to prioritize it and how much you can find the funding for it. And so we'll just keep doing this, I think, and as long as it takes, which is probably forever, and to finally meet those needs. But we've turned a corner, and we're heading that direction now. And so, to have in this package $87 million basically for kind of pedestrian amenities. There's 55 for sidewalks, 20 for bike lanes, like commuter bike lanes on streets, another 8 for trails. We did a lot with trails in MAPS 3 and in the 2017 bond. So we have a really awesome trail system. So maybe that's a little more modest here. And then finally, $4 million for street lights in areas that don't have them. That's a great commitment. I mean, you could do billions if you wanted to, but it's certainly a lot more than we've done, historically. And if we just keep at it, we'll eventually move the needle. And I think what you'll see here, it's certainly Councilman Cooper and Councilwoman Hammond were really focused on this particular item. And I think they really envision these pedestrian priority areas being changed. It's not just a sidewalk, it's sidewalk amenities, it's the bike lanes, it's taking a neighborhood and just completely changing the way it looks and feels, and doing that in quite a few different areas, around the city, and maybe just in a way sort of setting an example. So in the future, voters will demand even more and more and more of that as a priority.
Other questions? There's a question up front.
Are you saying the 900?
Hey, can you wait for the
Wait
microphone?
one moment for the
Yeah.
mic.
So are you saying in the $987 million package that you're not getting any bonds at all? That this is all paying cash as we go?
Right. So it's 978, and it is, that has always been the MAPS model, that we pay as we go. So there's no debt. So your $978 million buys $978 million worth of stuff, instead of so much of that going to interest. The only downside to that is just that it takes a little longer, but I think after 26 years, it feels like the people of Oklahoma City have gotten used to that and have prioritized patience and over spending their money on debt service, basically. So I think that's kind of been part of the MAPS model, is to pay as you go, and people like that their money goes farther, and also that these things open without debt. So I rode our streetcar with the mayor of Cincinnati a couple weeks ago, who was here, and they have a streetcar. And he said, "What's it cost to operate?" And I said, "About $4 million." And he said, "Well, yeah, that's about the same for us, about $4 million a year." And he said, "But of course we have the $2 million debt service." And I said, "Well, that's a shame. We don't have any debt service. We've paid for it,
Does federal money help out at all for operations? Maybe you don't know.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to, you've been talking about on transit specifically. Yeah. I mean, there's stuff grants and things. I mean, most of our transit comes locally, though, for sure. I mean, very little from the state. Federal sometimes is most help, like we're getting a federal grant for the construction of our bus rapid transit line that's going to go up Classen and Northwest Expressway, but I'm not aware of any major operating subsidy that'll come with that. So,
question up front here.
Not putting the cart before the horse, these 2 mental health facilities and the crisis centers, and you're not going to, have you already picked the idea where you're going to place these at, or you're going to basically do like what's happened in the past, get people out of downtown, and the undesirables, you'll move them to Penn, North Penn, and that area, or they're still up in the air where you're going to build these facilities?
Yeah, they are not cited, but the idea of having multiple does lend itself to geographic distribution, just so they're convenient for. I mean, these are typically the patients brought to a crisis center are I think most often brought there by police. I mean, these are people having a psychotic episode. So I know one's on Pershing and I'm touring it soon, but I don't know where the other one is. But I think the current one. But I think the idea would be geographic distribution. So yeah, probably not downtown.
Question over here. Here again, up front.
So as a follow-on to that exact question, I personally want to help advocate for people to vote for MAPS 4. I'm a new resident of Oklahoma City in the last year and a half, and some of the questions that I already am getting from people are about the location of these facilities, and out of concern for the neighborhoods, if people with families and small kids saying, I don't want people to be coming out of a crisis center or and I just wonder, how do we help educate people and raise awareness about the benefits of these services and covering these human needs, and how to help, raise awareness and empathy?
So do you have a background in this particular area, or, I mean, in mental health services? Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, I guess we just, and I'm a mayor, right? So I'm a jack of all trades, master of none, but
Kind of like a journalist.
But I think, maybe if you want to follow up with me, I'd be happy. Maybe we can, if you want like more, go a couple layers deep, maybe get in touch with some of our mental health service providers in the city to better understand exactly the practices of crisis centers, where they are today, how they affect or don't affect, their surrounding neighborhoods. If you're having those conversations, I mean, people come at Maps for Vote from a million different directions. Some people have really detailed questions, like I said earlier, about like, is the state, is the field north, south, or east, west? And some people are just like, when's the vote? Is it good? Maps is good, right? I'll go vote for that. And so but we're happy to try and answer if there's an answer, any question, no matter how detailed. And sometimes the answer is that that's not been answered yet. But I think in your case, it's really more of a looking at our existing crisis centers. I mean, believe me, as mayor, you get all the NIMBY, comments, and I've never fielded as my time as mayor a complaint about our existing crisis centers, if that's worth anything, So I certainly get complaints about lots of different things in our city and it's, how they affect their neighbors. But I don't think the crisis centers will have a negative effect on the neighborhoods that surround them. But feel free to follow up with me, and let's dig deeper and get some experts to say that, not just me.
Other questions? This gentleman, straight ahead.
On the aisle.
Yes, Mayor. Excuse me. Follow up on your comments about allocation of the additional $50 million from MAPS 3, allocation for neighborhoods in MAPS 4, and the senior centers. We're members of the Northwest Senior Center on Rockwell. It's been an overwhelming success. In fact, the membership and the usage has just grown far beyond its capacity. I know there's plans to do a few things. Can you speak a little bit about, for us, like my neighborhood, the Northwest Senior Center, but overall the senior centers around and how they will be helped by the future efforts here?
Yeah, so the senior centers have been a big win. They've taken a while. We only have 2 open, and we wish we had 4 open. But, the south one has just been, we think, mostly sited. The northeast one, which was actually supposed to be the first one to be built, has gone through a lot of iterations, but we think we're hopefully close to siting it. The first one to ultimately open is the one you're referring to up on Rockwell, and yeah, it's been a tremendous success. And so in some of those excess funds that we had from MAPS 3, we were able to allocate a little bit. I mean, just parking, like literally you were filling the parking lot, so we needed to build some more parking spaces. And so that's, I don't know exactly where that stands. Bob may know better than I, but there's help coming if it hasn't already come for that facility. The one in Capitol Hill that opened last year, the Pete White Senior Center, is beautiful, and both of them, in their own ways, change lives. I mean, we hear those stories and they're touching. They've really brought so many of our city seniors, at least the ones especially who live in those areas, into a social setting and into an athletic setting, that's been good for their mental health and their physical wellness. So they're exciting. The one in Capitol Hill, though, as I kind of alluded to earlier, hasn't necessarily done quite as well as in terms of membership as the first one. And I think we're really identifying that senior centers need to be in all parts of the city, but when they're in socioeconomic areas, lower socioeconomic areas, the membership just isn't as strong. And these are, the fees are, they can be significant, certainly above what the kind of fees or lack of fees that we usually have traditionally charged at our city's, rec centers. And so that kind of came out. That was a good example of something that really emerged out of the council meeting where we were talking about more senior centers for MAPS 4. And I had sort of thought maybe we'd build 2 more senior centers. We'd have Senior Center 5 and Senior Center 6. And ultimately, out of that conversation, the concern about the long-term viability of the one in Capitol Hill and maybe the one in Northeast was, I don't know that we need a 6th senior center as much as we need to shore up the senior centers we have, And so ultimately, what we're proposing here is a fund, in addition to the 5th senior center, a fund to subsidize these senior centers in lower socioeconomic areas so everybody can enjoy them and they survive. The model that was created with MAPS 3 was that they were all going to be operated essentially independently. At least that's the way it's evolved. And that causes that problem to accelerate, because if Capitol Hill and Rockwell were operated by the same operator, it might balance out, but unfortunately they have independent operators, and so we don't want to have to close them or subsidize them with general fund dollars. So this is a way to address that. And I just now see Mike over your shoulder there, who's intimately familiar. If you just want to turn around and ask him all these questions, Mike is the longtime subcommittee chair for the senior centers on MAPS 3. So there's a lot to unpack there, but in MAPS 4, we hope that we're addressing a geographic gap in the existing senior centers, and then we're sort of shoring up and ensuring the long-term viability of all the senior centers.
Mayor, I'll have to ask you about Chesapeake Arena. You mentioned you'd get to that. So what does it mean for keeping the Thunder here and happy, and what's after that for keeping them here and happy?
Well, I mean, to back up, historically, we built a $90 million arena. We opened it the year after Dallas opened a $400 million arena. And, that is what it is. We did it, bare bones to secure the long-term relocation of the team. We had to, it was clear that we had to do more. And so Big League City added another $100 million. But, we have now a $200 million arena in a world of $600, $700, $800 million arenas. And the thing on top of that is probably more important and more pressing is, our lease with the Thunder ends in the next 3 years. And people don't necessarily think about that. They expect people like me to worry about all that stuff, right? And figure it all out. They think of the Thunder as being here forever. But, we're subject to lease agreements and that have a finite time period. And so, we want to go to that negotiating table with as good a relationship as possible, with facilities that meet at least bare minimum national standards, or at least the expectation that the funding is in place to do that over the next decade. It's been 10 years since Big League City. It'll be 10 more years, by the time MAPS 4 concludes, at which point, the arena will be almost 30 years old. And this puts us in a position to, secure not just the Thunder, but concerts and all the other events that happen at Chesapeake Arena for another, 15 years. And extends the life of the arena, obviously, significantly. I mean, I think when you said what's next after that, I mean, I'm pretty sure that, because I think these improvements would roll out over a decade. I don't think they'd be like, up front in MAPS 4. I'm pretty sure that we're not going to, put the last coat of paint on in 2028 and then immediately tear down the arena and build a new one. I mean, I think this extends the life well into, the next decade after that. And then, again, let the next mayor or the mayor after that or the mayor after that figure the rest out. But my job is just to, leave this world a better place than I found it, and or at least as good. And in this case, I mean, I think that this investment ensures, first of all, it's totally in line, and in fact, probably below, the types of investments that are being made around the country. And it again, sort of secures our, future for the next 10, 15 years. With the Thunder and with concerts and with all the other things that people enjoy that certainly have changed our image and changed the way we see ourselves and have brought tremendous economic development. And, again, if you don't like it, it's less than, it's like 10% of the package. So there's 70% of these dollars in MAPS 4 go to neighborhood and human needs. And yet there's still a little bit there for those sort of more MAPS 1 and MAPS 3 type projects. That some people, a lot of people that I interact with on a daily basis prioritize. Again, something sort of for everyone there.
Okay, we'll take one final question. This gentleman had his hand up earlier in the third row. Yeah.
Hi. So my question is about the multi-purpose stadium. Mm-hmm. With the current funds that are projected for the stadium, it would be an 8,000 seat stadium, correct?
I think that's what I understood, yes.
Okay. For a professional soccer league team, so a Major League Soccer League team.
Like MLS.
Yes.
Yeah.
We would need a 15,000 seat stadium, which I'm sure you're aware of.
Yeah.
But do you think the public is aware of this? And if they would still want this project, knowing that we would have another minor league team similar to like the Blazers or the Barons? Or do you think that the public supports this idea with the thought that this is going to be for a major league professional team like the Thunder that we love.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've been transparent about that as we possibly can be. No one has portrayed this as an MLS stadium, which is more like a $200 million investment currently. I look at it kind of like the Ford Center, to use the old name, was back when it opened in Maps 1, which was, as I described earlier, a $90 million stadium at the time or arena in a world of $400 million arenas. You know, it was a step forward. It was significantly more than what we had in the past, which to that point was the Myriad. But it really wasn't ready for major league level, for a permanent franchise. And so ultimately there was kind of a two-step process. And I think in this case, even, the stadium is half what the Energy ownership had proposed. They were interested in a $70 million facility, but even that was not an MLS stadium. But this, again, sort of gets us, a little farther down the road, presumably retains professional soccer. USL is not a bad league. It is not the MLS, but it is not a bad league at all. But we have the only team in the entire USL that plays in a high school stadium. So it gets us, into a better place with the USL. And again, allows us to have opportunities that for a city our size, we surprisingly fall short of today. We can't even, when we had the presentation at council on this particular project, the head of the OSSAA came and he said, I would love to put the 5A and 6A football championships in Oklahoma City, but you don't have a venue. I have people contact me all the time, wanting me to chase whatever, minor league football flavor of the month that is out there. And again, I always say to them, that's, of course we'd love to have, why not? I mean, even though they go out of business, they don't like drag the city down with them, but, why not have a AAF or XFL or whatever, but we don't have a venue. We don't have a stadium, there's nowhere for them to play. And so, this gives us those opportunities, as well as some concert series that come to places like that really wouldn't kind of pass through here. So this is definitely, for where we are today, it's transformational. It is not an MLS stadium, but it keeps us on that path. If we did nothing, it'd be pretty evident that we're not going to be in the professional soccer game for much longer. And then we'd be that much farther away from the MLS. If that's your passion, and some people, it certainly is, I think that's, through process of elimination, that's the next professional sports team for Oklahoma City, whenever that day is. We're just sort of preserving that possibility, I think, with this project. And then, you see if the stars align sometime, just like they did in 2008 with the Thunder. And, you had an ownership group, you had a team that wanted to be here. You just had to have the facilities. And so, we went back to the voters and all those things were put together. Today we don't have an MLS team or a billionaire owner looking to move here, but 6 years from now, maybe we will, and we'll have that conversation as a community, but we can't have that conversation with Taft Stadium, So I should say, and I should have said this up front, this stadium would be it would be like the Ford Center in that it would be the stadium we'd build around, the idea here being that it would be, expandable to be that. Should that day ever arrive, should the people of Oklahoma City and the MLS and all those things want to work together.
Mayor, before final remarks, one quick question. One of those projects, it's $500,000 for outdoor basketball courts and pickleball.
Yeah.
Am I missing something? Is there an explosion of pickleball?
Oh my gosh! Yes.
Going to
oh my
be
gosh!
Really? Is it going to take over? Forget soccer.
John, that is. You have just gotten yourself like hundreds of pickleball emails.
Okay.
Yeah. I have often said it. It is absolutely the truth. The thing I have heard most organic, I've heard the most, and it's totally organic, is pickleball over the last 9 months. There were lots of sort of organized campaigns of supporters, for various projects, and they represented real people. But the thing that was just coming out of nowhere, individuals coming at me, was always pickleball. And I like saying it too. So, it's kind of fun to say pickleball. So, as I was putting all this together and I just thought, what, this is, the pickleball industrial complex is going to be really thrilled with this little line item here. So
if you don't know what it is, there are plenty of explanations and videos online. So, and if you're getting into those older years, it does look inviting. So. Final question. The resolution talks a lot about, if there's one word in this 10-page document that seems to be repeated over and over, and that is transform, transformational. So with MAPS 4, do you think when it's halfway through, when it's all done, it's going to be that dramatically transformational for Oklahoma City?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when you look at each of these items, the power of the youth centers. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure you've heard the stories of how Boys and Girls Clubs have changed lives. Think of replicating that, many times over through MAPS. The diversion hub, we haven't gotten the chance to talk about. Think of, the lives that will be changed. We have too many people cycling, through our criminal justice system who have a much better path out there for themselves. They just need, something like this project to get them there. I could go on and on. The homelessness housing, $50 million. That's $50 million more than our city's ever put into something like this. On and on and on. It's transforming people's neighborhoods. We talked a little bit that with the sidewalks, but it's also transforming people's lives through things like Palomar and homelessness and domestic violence and the mental health and the diversion hub and so on. And so, no, I absolutely think it's transformational. And if your definition of transformational is big, shiny stuff, well, we got a stadium, we have, we got an arena, we have the State Fair Coliseum, and those will certainly be transformational in the way our city looks and feels and the way we enjoy, entertainment in this city. But what I think has been the focus for me and for many people throughout this process has been the idea of transforming people's lives in their neighborhoods. And I think absolutely that's what we're doing here. And I'm excited to see its potential. We have really broad support. I'm very optimistic about the vote. I do think it meets the people where they're at in 2019. And then I'm even more excited and optimistic and anxious to see it all play out in the years ahead.
Thanks so much. The vote is December 10th. Please give the mayor a hand of applause for
Thank you.